Hello, my name is Kei Ueda. I'm curator of the Japanese diaspora collection at the Hoover Institutional Library and Archives and the editor of the exhibition companion book, Fanning the Flames, Propaganda in Modern Japan. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Fanning the Flames speaker series. We also have an accompanying online exhibition website at fanningtheflames.hoover.org, which I encourage you to visit after the talk. In addition, our exhibition, located in Hoover Tower, is now open to the public through July 2022. Reservations are required, so please visit our website for details. We'd like to thank the director of the Hoover Institution, Condoleezza Rice, for her support of the library and archives and our programs. And we also like to thank the overseers of Hoover Institution, our board of directors, and other donors without whose support nothing we do would be possible. Now, just a housekeeping note. At the end of the presentation, we'll open the program for questions and answers. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen to type your question. Without further ado, now let me introduce you to today's speaker. Professor Karl Friday received his PhD from Stanford in 1989 and is Professor Emeritus in the Graduate School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Saitama University and the University of Georgia. A specialist in the Heian and Kamakura periods, his publications include Hired Swords, The Rise of Private Warrior Power in Early Japan, Legacies of the Sword, the Kashima Shinryu and Samurai Martial Culture, Samurai Warfare and State in Early Medieval Japan, The First Samurai, The Life and Legend of the Warrior Rebel Taira Masakado, Japan Emerging, Pre-Modern History to 1850, the Routledge Handbook of Pre-Modern Japanese History, and numerous shorter works. Now to you, Professor Friday.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to, first of all, thank Professor Ueda and the Hoover Institute for inviting me back to campus, even if virtually. Let me go ahead and, I can't talk and do technology at the same time, so let me share the screen. Japan, like any other country, is really a product of its past, but I think, and there's nothing unusual there. But there's a real tendency, I think, in any place, but especially in countries like Japan or China, to exaggerate and romanticize the hold of the past. Westerners in particular just want to believe that every Japanese businessman is basically a samurai wearing a suit, and that every Japanese woman is a master of tea ceremony and or ikebana. And that the explanation for almost anything that you find the Japanese do remotely differently from whatever country is analyzing them can be found in ancient traditions. This is, of course, not just a Western perception. Japanese also fall prey to the same kind of thinking. And in part, of course, because the government in Japan, or successive governments in Japan, have actually encouraged that sort of thinking to sell policies of sort. It's certainly been going on at least since the late 19th century. Of course, the best, one of the most famous, at least, treatments of this is the Stephen Vlastos collection that you see up there on the slide. I want to look at that a little more carefully. It would actually, I think, be difficult to find any facet of Japan's cultural heritage that has the kind of the power of hold on the world's popular imagination as the samurai. For the most part, this is a positive image. They're the heroes of movies and TV shows and novels and such, and role models for hundreds of thousands of martial arts students around the globe. But of course, there's also an interesting sinister side to this, especially for the World War II generation, the political left in Japan, people in the countries that Japan occupied during the war and such. For those groups, the samurai tradition is still cited as a source of both the mindset that launched the war and the norms and values of the soldiers who fought it, and always, of course, in a negative fashion. Both of these are said to have been conditioned by and derived from an ancient code of warrior behavior called Bushidō, literally the way of the warrior. You see the two famous quotes there, the Lord Russell of Liverpool and Arthur Swinson's famous book. And again, the connection of the imperial army to the samurai tradition wasn't entirely a Western invention. In fact, was an important part of the modern state's early propaganda. And it remained a favorite theme of militarism right-wing essayists right up to Japan's defeat in 1945, and then even after that, among the right wing in Japan. The problem, though, is that this whole idea of soldiers as modern samurai is mostly a matter of wishful thinking on the part of the early modern states propaganda, or the modern states rather, early propaganda. It remained a favorite theme of militarist and right-wing essay, mostly a product of wishful thinking, I'm sorry. There's really no more substance to it than the ads you used to see. I haven't seen these lately, but the ads by the modern US Army and Marines showing knights and gladiators and such, and saying, join up and be like these guys. Yep. Well, obviously, let me take a quick digression here. I don't have time today for a detailed account of the origins of the samurai, although I can recommend a couple of good books. But here's a really, really brief summary, because Professor Ueda asked me to throw this in. Around the turn of the 8th century, the newly recreated, restyled imperial house, now calling itself the imperial house using Chinese terminology instead of native terminology, and its supporters secured their position at the top of the socio-political hierarchy by creating a very elaborate battery of governing institutions that were modeled largely on those of Tang China. And of course, these included numerous provisions for both domestic law enforcement and foreign defense. Contrary to what you see in most textbooks and popular belief and such, these institutions were not just adopted wholesale and uncritically. They were very carefully adapted to meet Japanese needs, but there were problems here. And particularly, right from the beginning, different goals and requirements of the states were in conflict with one another sometimes. And the result was that the imperial state, or Ritsuyo military apparatus, incorporated a fairly large number of unhappy compromises. And then problems inherent in the system at its inception were made much worse over the next few decades by changing conditions. So that by the mid-700s, the court was reevaluating its martial needs and restructuring its armed forces. You see here is a series of adjustments and amendments and general reforms, a lot of tinkering and experimenting. And the most important component of this was experimenting and adjusting was the amplification of the role of elites in the new military establishment. That is, the members of the upper tiers of provincial society and the lower echelons of the court nobility. And the result of that then was the gradual emergence of what's essentially an order or a group of professional fighting men in the countryside and the capital, the group we call the Bushi, or more commonly in English, the samurai. Now, of course, warriors did eventually basically take over the reins of government and such in Japan, but it's important to remember this was an extremely slow process. This new warrior order emerged rapidly during the 9th and 10th century and had a monopoly on military force and such certainly by the early 10th century. But the takeover process, politically and economically, only just began near the end of the 12th century. And even then it was slow. Warriors gradually wrested control of Japan's lands and people from the court, and over the course of the next 4 centuries, and by the end of that point, we're effectively ruling the country. And so you see the rule of law in many respects giving way to a kind of, this is an exaggeration, but not a horrible one, giving way to essentially a Darwinian struggle of survival of the strongest. So that by the dawn of the 15th century, warriors dominated the countryside and the whole of the socioeconomic and political structure of Japan. But the unraveling process, of course, didn't end there. Power continued to spin off from the capital to the countryside, real power coming to depend more and more on pyramids of control and relationships that were built from the ground up, rather than lines of authority that extend from the center out and from the top down. And what you got was a century and a half or so of near constant civil warfare between warlords, daimyo. And the two famous terms that describe this, Gekokujo, the low overthrowing the high, and my favorite, Jakuniku Kyoshoku, the weak are meat, the strong eat. And all of that, of course, then ended with the emergence of the early modern polity between approximately 1580 and 1640. Now to get back, that really is a very quick summary of samurai history, but to get back more specifically to talking about Bushido, both popular writers and scholars talk a lot about samurai values and ethical norms. And they tend to describe Bushido as a relatively unified, well-defined construct. But this is a terribly, terribly misleading idea. First of all, there's a question of the term itself. It was almost never used before the Tokugawa period, before the early modern period, rarely used even by writers during that period. In fact, the single most famous work on Bushido is Nitobe Inazo's Bushido, the Soul of Japan, which was written in 1899 in English and later translated into Japanese because it became so popular. But Nitobe actually thought he'd invented the term because there really wasn't a standard term for it. And the bottom line, though, is it really has no set meaning, in spite of what coffee table books and general histories and martial arts books and things tend to suggest. The idea of proper samurai behavior and values has, in fact, always been a fairly vague concept. And it's important to realize that samurai values changed dramatically sometimes, certainly substantially over time, particularly, as I'll get to in just a second, as you move into the early modern period. But even during the Tokugawa period, there was a lot of debate and very, very little agreement. I like to tell students that the way to understand Bushido is to think of it in the same class of terms as words like patriotism or masculinity or femininity, which is to say, these are qualities that almost everybody agrees are good things to have. Everybody wants to be considered patriotic, for example, but very few people agree on exactly what the details of the term or the constructs actually mean. Is Edward Snowden a patriot, or maybe Geertz Wilders? Is Angela Merkel more or less feminine than Marilyn Monroe? And, you know, that's an endless debate. Even though both would probably say would reject the idea that they're not feminine. In fact, there was actually very little discussion in written form of proper warrior behavior, warriorness, until the Tokugawa period. So fundamentally, to the extent that there's any real such thing as Bushido as a actually actively discussed thing, it's this whole concept of a code of conduct for the samurai is really a product of the 17th and 18th centuries, a period significantly when Japan was basically at peace. It doesn't come out of the medieval age of the country at war. And of course, the early modern period is defined by three very dramatic changes to warrior circumstances. First of all, samurai were converted into a legally privileged hereditary order for the first time, a transformation from what had been a very porous occupational group defined mainly by possession of certain skills. Although, to be sure, there were hereditary warrior houses, but still, you know, moving in and out of, especially at the bottom, moving in and out of what would be samurai-ness, warrior, becoming a warrior was very, very fluid. But it moves from that to, for the first time, a socio-political estate or caste in which membership was almost entirely hereditary. The second big change, samurai were moved off the land. Until the late 16th century, they had been mostly landed feudal lords. But in the late 1500s, daimyo began pulling them in off the land, partly out of military considerations, new tactics and use of bigger castles and more often, more frequent fighting, that sort of thing that made it useful to have your warriors handy and assembled all the time rather than scattered on their own lands across your domain. But even more importantly, as a means to make them less independent of the lord. And this process then continued through the early 1600s, so that by the mid 17th century, most samurai were living in castle towns on stipends and had no direct or even theoretical connections to land. By 1700, 90% of the samurai class was living on stipends. And then the third big change, a virtual end to fighting, which I've already alluded to. Samurai, after this, now spent most of their time either completely unemployed, or if they were working as government bureaucrats. And over time, unsurprisingly, they tended to become more and more bureaucrats descended from warriors and less battlefield warriors who were simply acting as bureaucrats on the side. And all of that then put together dramatically changed the basic relationship between lords and vassals. What had always been a mutual and codependent sort of tie was now one-sided, the vassal becoming completely dependent on the lord. It also made the relationship much less personal. The pledge of loyalty became more or less, and was never couched in the terminology didn't change and the concept didn't change, but the reality was that it became kind of ritual. Daimyo became in reality less a personal leader than the head of the bureaucratic hierarchy in which the samurai was employed. Loyalty was really, in reality, directed more toward the domain, not even though it was focused on the lord, not directed to him as a person. It no longer mattered what kind of person the lord was, which was certainly not the case before that. So what you're seeing, and this I think is very significant for how easily Japan was able to modernize in the late 19th century, the emergence already here of something that's much more akin to modern patriotism than traditional feudal sort of loyalty. So that the upshot was that by the end of the Tokugawa period, by the time you get to the late 19th century, the samurai become a very different thing from what they had been before. In terms of lifestyle and personality and such, they would probably have been virtually unrecognizable to their late medieval ancestors. By the same token, of course, very few of them would have admitted that there was any difference. They would say, no, I mean, circumstances are slightly different, but basically I could pop back into the 16th century and fit in just fine. But the reality is, no, that's not true. They were very different creatures. Well, as the reality of that new situation began to actually set in, it gave birth to a kind of identity crisis, sort of an epic sort of identity crisis, in fact. The fundamental problem now becoming, how do you define the rights and role of a fighting man in an era that essentially has no fighting? I mean, that's fine for a few years in between wars, but when you start getting into the second and third generation and saying, I've never been on a battlefield, Grandpa's never been on a battlefield, my great-grandfather never actually fought any place. This is this identity crisis then becomes the main problem that was addressed by the so-called Bushidō writers. The term Bushidō, of course, again, literally means the way of the warrior, but in terms of accurate translation, you might be better off translating it as the way of a not quite a warrior, because it was the philosophy concerning the nature, the essence of what it meant to be a warrior formulated by men who've never actually been anywhere near a war. So you have this malaise concerning the role of fighting men in an era that doesn't have any fighting. The whole dilemma set out most succinctly, I think, by Yamaga Soko, who's the quotation you see on the slide there. And as people began to talk about it, the ideas about behavior became farther and farther divorced from any kind of practical reality. They became formalized and ritualized and dehumanized, often quaint and pontificating. Now, of course, a fairly similar process that's repeated itself multiple times in the modern era. First of all, in the early Meiji period, and Japan went through this enormous period of self-consciousness in the face of Westernization. Then again, during the Russo-Japanese War era, when Japan has this new self-confidence of standing up to the largest army in the world. The World War I era, when Japan did quite well, but also was suddenly slapped in the face once again with the realization of the enormous technology and industrial power gap that still existed between them and the Western powers. And then again, in the early Showa period, the pre-war era, dominated by militarism and the imperial way, and in the post-war era, with the reemergence of the right wing and the whole samurai on Wall Street sort of ethic that began developing in the 80s and 90s. And of course, what all of these things have in common, all of these moments have in common, is the question of identity, Japan versus the world. Bushidō being picked up and touted as the essence of Japanese national identity, which of course is in direct contradiction to what the Tokugawa writers will talk about. I'll get this more in a minute, but the essence of what the Tokugawa writers were interested in is what separates samurai from the rest of society. The idea that the one thing they probably would have agreed on is that samurai are different from everybody else, and the idea that the Bushi values are simply Japanese values would have appalled them. But once again, a tremendous diversity of construct here across all of these things, dozens and dozens of competing and sometimes totally incompatible ideas. So Bushidō is basically an omnibus construct. It means whatever the writer wants to emphasize at any given time. And the thing is that almost none of these early modern and modern incarnations of Bushidō have any real basis at all in historical reality. So what I want to do now then is look a little bit at the historical reality, starting with the concept of honor, which of course is very central to the notion of Bushidō. Thing is, honor is a very slippery construct. In everyday discourse, we tend to act as if to treat it as if it were a sort of transcendent, universal, and timeless ideal. But it's clearly not. Now, I think you can probably make a reasonable argument that most cultures and most times and places have some kind of analogous construct to what the English notion of honor, personal honor. But so, it's universal, it could be arguably universal in that sense. The idea of something that's sort of like honor would be, analogous to honor is universal, or important everywhere. But the specifics of what kinds of behaviors are and are not honorable have always varied dramatically, sometimes across time and space. They're very specific to each where and when. The first problem you run into when you're dealing with the idea of honor in Japan is that there really is no single equivalent term. In fact, one of my colleagues, my Stanford senpai, Hitomi Tonomura, once pointed out that she absolutely forbids her students to use the word honor in class or in their papers, because there's no one word, so you're throwing things around. You have modern vocabulary like meio or koe or eio, homare and such. But none of these were used in the context of warrior behavior until modern times. And the pre-modern and early modern vocabulary that we're translating as honor varied. There were a lot of different terms, but most of them were things like me or memmoku, sometimes memboku, that of course all have more to do with name and reputation than they do with the kind of internal ethical imperative that's implied in the English word honor. And that's important. In medieval Japan and classical Japan, name and reputation were absolutely at the heart of a warrior's self-perception. Reputation and pride were almost tangible entities. They took precedence over virtually all other obligations. You find example after example from the 10th century onward of warriors who, for the sake of their reputations, will refuse orders from superiors, risk the loss of or sacrifice valuable retainers, even murder men to whom they owed their lives, or sacrificing their own lives or those of their family. Slights to reputation and honor were often catalysts to bloodshed and belligerence. Breaches of etiquette and failure to show proper respect very frequently led to violent consequences. Reputations and concerns about it could even reach beyond the warrior himself, even beyond his lifespan, so that warriors could prosper through the inherited glory of their ancestors or suffer stigma from their disgraces. And filial piety rather, and familial reputation were frequently the cause of warfare. Interestingly, large-scale vendettas of the sort, the Hatfield-McCoy sort of thing, were surprisingly rare in Japan, but attempts to avenge slights or crimes against family members were troublesome enough to merit specific mention in shogunal law for both of the first two medieval regimes, the Kamakura and the Muromachi shogunates. The fact is that even a warrior's life could be of less consequence to him than his name and image. In accounts of battles, we see numerous sketches of warriors choosing to sacrifice themselves in order to enhance their reputations or to enhance the reputations of their families later. But, all of that fits, I think, fairly nicely with everybody's picture of Bushidō. But really need to be very careful here about making what amount to anachronistic or ethnocentric assumptions about the nature of samurai honor. Because it's true, as I've been pointing out here, that the reputation was of profound importance to warrior self-perception, but it also is true that it turned almost entirely on military reputation, which in turn rested first and foremost on the warrior's record of victories. So it's very different from the concepts like European chivalry, which was at least in part a prescriptive and proscriptive code of conduct. Early medieval Japanese equivalents, like the way of the horse and bow, were simply vocational descriptions. And unlike their European counterparts, Japanese warriors were almost never faced with choosing between, if ever, faced with choosing between military advantage and adherence to some sort of abstract chivalric norms. Medieval Japanese concepts of honor and honorable conduct in battle were extremely flexible, and they permitted an enormously wide range of behaviors. Some of these are very much in harmony with notions of honor in the way that modern Western audiences would understand it, and others were shockingly dishonorable viewed through contemporary eyes. So let's take a look at some specifics here real briefly. One very interesting account is about two 10th century warriors, Taira Koremochi and Fujiwara Moroto. It's recorded in the Konjaku Monogatari-shu, which is a didactic tale collection, probably compiled somewhere around the late 12th century, but maybe earlier. There's some disagreement, and I'm, to be honest with you, I haven't paid attention to the most recent literature specialist debate on this. But in any case, in the story here, a dispute over a piece of land begins to fester between them, fueled by gossip, going back and forth. Eventually, one challenges the other, and they agree on a date and place to meet. But, and again, this all fits nicely. But then as the day of battle approaches, one of them, Moroto, discovered through his scouts that he was outnumbered about 3-1 and decided that discretion being the better part of valor, he ran away, took off to hide in a neighboring province. And what's interesting is the text that records this tale tells us that, this is a quote, or my translation, but those who spoke between the warriors pronounced favorably on this. There's no criticism of it. In fact, he's admired for it. Well, Koremochi got the news and determined then that, okay, so I guess it's over. So he demobilized his troops. But then just a few days later, he and his household are awakened, Koremochi and his household are awakened from sleep by the sounds of Moroto approaching with a sizable force. Moroto's men then surround Koremochi's compound, and they set fire to all the buildings and shoot down anyone who tries to get out to escape the fire. So they wait till the fire has burned itself out, and they search through the ashes. And again, this is a quote, discovering men of high and low rank, children and the like, all told more than 80 persons burned to death. So then Moroto packs up and heads home. On the way back, he stops at the home of his brother-in-law to give his troops a rest. And his brother-in-law, who interestingly won't let him into his house, but he does send out food and sake for the troops. And Moroto's men party. They drink and eat until they pass out. Well, those of you that are movie fans have probably already smelled this coming, but Koremochi, of course, was not dead. He had, in fact, escaped early on by seizing the robe of one of his serving women, presumably killing her in the process, and then slipped past the attackers under the cover of smoke, messing up his hair so that he looked like a woman. And people were not paying attention to him as much, apparently. And then he hid in the reeds of a nearby stream until the fighting was over and Moroto's troops had withdrawn. Some of his own troops then find him the next morning, having heard about what happened, and they resupply him with clothing and weapons and a horse as he explains what had happened. And he claims that he didn't flee into the mountains at the beginning of the attack like he might have, because he feared this would have left behind the reputation of one who had run away. Doesn't explain why he then turned around and ran away. But in any case, his men counsel him to reassemble his forces and then go after Moroto, because at this point, the Moroto's forces outnumber the people who are gathered here about 5 or 6 to 1. But Koremoto then shakes off this advice. Says, to show myself to you for even one day is extremely shameful. Therefore, I will not be stingy with this dew-like life. You may assemble an army and fight later, but as for myself, I will go on to attack alone. No doubt I will send off but a single arrow and then die. But to choose otherwise would be a limitless shame for my descendants. Well, that all sounds very well and good. So, but there's a catch to this. Koremochi then tracks down Moroto's troops, falls on them with his troops, catching them completely by surprise. They're all drunk, they're all passed out, they're all unarmed and able to offer almost no defense at all, and soon he's killed them to a man. Then he doesn't make the mistake that Moroto had made. He finds Koremochi's body, takes the head, and then leaves the rest behind. But then he moves on to Moroto's house, which he also burns down and kills everybody in it. So here you've got a very interesting story. Koremochi's obsession with honor, of course, jumps out at you, but it's very complicated. On the one hand, you have the challenge and agreement on place and time, the refusal to run at the beginning of Moroto's attack and such. Those all fit pretty well with, I think, modern ideas and expectations about samurai honor. So does his stirring speech to the men after they find him. But then on the other hand, you have his method of escape itself. his counterstrike, his gratuitous destruction of Monoto's house, Monoto's gratuitous murder of civilians and such. Those don't fit so well. And then we have another incident, and this is also in the same text, but it describes one of the more famous and celebrated warriors of the time, Taida Sadamichi, his tactics in carrying out an order to hunt down and kill another warrior. He was ordered to do this by Minamoto Yorinobu, who was the younger brother of Sadamichi's overlord Yorimitsu. And he initially refuses to take the assignment. He doesn't tell Yorinobu that, he just tells his people, yeah, I'm not going to do this. He doesn't like the circumstances of the order. Yorinobu, it was given from across the room, shouted at a party when everybody was drunk. He said, that's not right. And I don't owe anything to Yorinobu. He may be my employer's younger brother, but I don't work for him and such. But then later he happens to run into the victim on the road, and Sadamichi at first befriends the man and wins his confidence. And they seem to be getting along just fine, but then the guy makes the mistake of suggesting that, well, I'm glad to hear that you're not taking up the order because it might not have been an easy fight for you, which irritates Sadamichi to the point where he decides on the spot that, okay, well, in that case. And so they part amiably, at which point Sadamichi rides out of sight, puts on his armor, gets his boat and weapons together, and returns minutes later, catching the opponent unarmored and riding along on a pack horse, and shoots him down before he can even get close to his weapons. Another tale about samurai from that same period, a man slays another warrior who had killed his father by disguising himself as a servant, bringing in food and sneaking into the man's room while he rested in the home of the samurai's lord, and then slitting his throat while he slept. The Azuma Kagami, the Kamakura Shogun, its own didactic record of its history, recounts how Minamoto Yoritomo, the founder of the shogunate, had one of his men executed for treason. He did this by summoning him to his quarters and entertaining him with food and drink, in the midst of which one of his other retainers stepped forward and lopped the guy's head off. So in all of these stories, the acceptance of both warrior and non-warrior audiences of this sort of behavior is absolutely standout striking. There's no suggestion anywhere in these accounts that this kind of conduct is improper or dishonorable, and in fact, quite the opposite. They're always talking about how smart these warriors are and how what great men they are because they thought of doing this. Well, one reason, of course, that much of the behavior in these tales seems so dishonorable to us today is the prominent role of deception and guile. But of course, fondness for surprise attacks and ambush is not by any matter of means unique to Japan. Medieval European lords also built very happily on tactics of betrayal and deception when it served their purposes. You find the use of guile in almost every aspect of medieval European warfare. Knights applauded guile and cunning and surprise, even in tournaments. But even so, the Japanese attitude toward this issue really does stand out. In Europe, deception was basically acceptable only within limits. It was restricted by conventions of war that were designed to regulate fighting to the mutual benefit of both sides. I mean, war in medieval Europe was very largely just a way to make a living, almost a kind of sport. There were formalized conventions of oaths and truths and declarations and challenges, and deception and tricks were legal, but only within the context of legalistic sorts of loopholes. In other words, nobody was bothered by low cunning. That wasn't dishonorable, but it was dishonorable and censorable to purge yourself in an oath where you promised not to do that. So what you had to do was phrase the oath carefully and then tiptoe around the lines. But and this may be something of a fine point, but Japanese custom really lacked even those sorts of qualifications. Promises and truces were violated over and over again with impunity. In fact, Heian period audiences, the late classical period, considered surprise attacks by warriors so normal and fair that an 11th century text could begin its description of what it calls the archetypical Bushi, the greatest warrior in the land, by informing us that he was highly skilled in the conduct of battles, night attacks, archery duels on horseback, and ambushes. So that's 50% of his most important skills are involve sneaky things. But again, go back the other way here. You want to be very careful about calling this unsavory because you have to keep in mind the degree to which that sort of judgment reflects ethnocentric or anachronistic standards for behavior. Measured against the war conventions of their own time and place, medieval warrior tactics were no less noble or heroic, absolutely no more treacherous or underhanded than those of their European contemporaries, or for that matter, of Western literary heroes. Japanese rules of engagement demanded only that warriors concern themselves with the most efficient means of bringing about the desired result. The ends always justified the means, virtually any means. So one of the things I think that may be going on here is a notion that warriors are supposed to be always on guard, always prepared for, always expecting an attack. You see this commonly in early modern and modern commentaries on martial art. And if that's the case, if you accept that as a premise, then taking somebody by surprise, catching him off guard is not taking unfair advantage any more than attacking an opponent through an opening in his guard during a formal fencing match or a duel, or for that matter, pulling off a good head fake when you're playing basketball. You know, he's supposed to be watching for that. If he fell for it, it's his problem. It's not on me. So second really major theme of popular notions of samurai values is the idea of loyalty. Loyalty of a samurai is always said to have been unconditional and utterly selfless. And of course, exhortations to loyalty are found everywhere in the written record about by samurai. You see them in shogunal regulations, you see them in daimyo house laws, you see them in 17th and 18th century treatises on Bushidō. But there are a lot of problems involved in jumping from that to the interpretation that loyalty was in fact a fundamental part of medieval warrior character. For one thing, unrestricted loyalty to subjects to their rulers wasn't samurai value. It was a Confucian value in general, and it was meant to apply to everyone. Concept predates even the existence of a Japanese nation by hundreds of years, and derives little or nothing from any military tradition per se. Daimyo who called on their retainers to render them unflinching loyalty were really just exhorting subjects on a traditional and general theme of government. And there's also a logical fallacy here involved in trying to deduce norms of actual behavior from formal legal and moral codes. As the truth is that selfless displays of loyalty by warriors are conspicuous in the Japanese historical record, mainly because of their absence. From the beginnings of the samurai and lord-vassal bond in the 8th century to the onset of the early modern age, ties between master and retainer were always contractual. They were based very heavily on mutual interest and mutual advantage, and heavily conditioned by the demands of self-interest. Medieval warriors were loyal to their lords only to the degree that it benefited them to be. They could, and they did, readily switch allegiances whenever the situation seemed to warrant it. In fact, there are very few, possibly none, no battles in Japanese history in which defection, or no important battles anyway, in which defection, often right in the middle of the fighting by one or more of the major players, didn't play a role. The standout feature of particularly the earliest warrior alliances, but also through most of the medieval period, was fragility. In the classical period, this is a reflection of the essentially amorphous nature of the lord-vassal bond during the period. Unlike land commendation arrangements and such that produce the estates shown, alliances between warriors were not supported by legal contracts. Formal arrangements under which specific benefices were offered in return for defined military services didn't develop very rapidly. They came about very, very slowly in Japan. And so at least until the Kamakura period, the ability of warrior leaders to manipulate any forms of, and well beyond that, in fact, to manipulate any forms of carrot or stick in order to recruit or to maintain or to control followers was very closely circumscribed by their relatively weak political circumstances. Even the most powerful warriors of the age occupied only intermediate positions in the socio-political hierarchy. And they were totally dependent on connections with the higher echelons of the court in order to maintain their own political and economic positions. They had very, very, very limited autonomy in matters of governance and landholding. Sometimes some practical autonomy, but never theoretical, which meant that they lacked the right and therefore the means to reward or punish their own troops directly. At least until well into the Kamakura period, warriors basically mercenaries. They were selling skills and services in exchange for long-term patronage of their careers by court powers that be, or sometimes for more immediate sorts of smaller rewards. And allegiances then were only as strong as a warrior's perception that the affiliation was working to his advantage. And classical and medieval warrior allegiances were further circumscribed by the multi-tiered hierarchical structure of warrior networks. Loyalties of lower ranking figures in this pyramid, this very complex hierarchy, to those at the top were at best tenuous. They were buffered at each intermediate level by loyalties to, or lack thereof, to an immediate superior. And ideological constraints were not really terribly valuable in inducing loyalty either. You find late medieval texts that talk about warrior behavior, particularly early warrior behavior, texts like Heike Monogatari that are filled with edifying tales attesting to fierce loyalty. And earlier sources, more reliable ones, do give some hints that warriors were not entirely oblivious to the concept of loyalty as a virtue. But again, the real effect of this kind of notion on samurai behavior was very minimal. For the most part, classical and medieval warriors viewed loyalty as a commodity, one that was predicated on adequate remuneration. It was not an obligation that transcended self-interest. It only became that sort of thing during the Tokugawa period when warriors were utterly dependent on their overlords, and daimyo could then demand this sort of level of loyalty from their retainers. So military alliances tended for most of samurai history to be nebulous and rather short-lived entities. And the larger the organization got, the more ephemeral it tended to be. I'm running a little bit behind, so I'm going to kind of skip my next slide here. I was going to talk in a little more detail about 14th century warriors, but let me just skip to the summary here, and then we can deal with some, leave time for questions. So yeah, the points you see here, the samurai notions, what I'm trying to say here today is that samurai notions concerning honor and duty and loyalty were always very complex, and they varied a great deal from era to era. So that even in the early modern period, when Bushidō, or the way of the warrior, became the subject of written pontification, you have dramatic disagreements about the details. Samurai ideals about honor were also very different from Western ideals, both modern and medieval. And most importantly, well, I think you want to be very careful, though, about in one direction or the other, overlaying or reading into the samurai behavior our own concepts and expectations concerning samurai behavior. So I'm going to leave it at that. One last word here. And I think we can open this for questions now.
Thank you very much, Professor Friday. So we have a few questions that I'd like to start with. How do modern movies contribute to misunderstanding of Bushidō? And how about manga as well?
Well, you know, a detailed answer that would take a lot longer than we have here. But, you know, it's exactly what I've been saying. You know, you have these romantic images, some of them Western imagination, some of them modern Japanese imagination that create a very different image of the samurai from what they actually were at any given time and place. And in most samurai movies, the majority tend to want to turn them into heroes. And they revolve around these ideas of selfless honor and self-sacrifice and such, and completely miss what's actually going on. And of course, they also tend to get a lot of the details of the way wars are fought, or wars were fought, and the political structures and things like that wrong as well.
So the next question is, maybe in your opinion, which film depicts the samurai best?
Yeah, that's a good question. I tend to like movies. When I can, I like to use them in classes because it gives students pictures, and I think that sticks with them. But you have to be very careful. There aren't really very many good movies about medieval or early medieval or classical warriors. They all tend to be pretty badly anachronistic or just silly fantasy. There are several pretty good ones, though, that deal with recent ones that deal with warriors during the Tokugawa period. A good bit of cinema is, of course, what I just said. It's all fantasy, but I particularly like the movie Seppuku, sometimes called Harakiri in English. The original version is much better than the remake. It was 2001 or something, the remake. The original version is from 63 or somewhere thereabouts, but that does a wonderful job. A little poetic license. It packs about 150 years of evolution of this Bushidō ethic into the lifetime of one warrior. But it's about a warrior who was actually a 16th century battlefield warrior, now living as an impoverished Ronin, unemployed warrior during the Tokugawa period, and the enormous contrast between his notion of honor and value and the way a warrior should conduct himself, and the notion subscribed to by the E family, which of course is an offshoot of the Tokugawa, very close to the shogun's family. There's a very good movie called Hana that's set right in the middle of the Tokugawa period, and does a very good job of showing that samurai were not much like what most people think they were. It's about a warrior who's hanging out in a slum, and they're looking for the man who killed his father, not because he wants to, but because his family insists on it. And you find out that he, even though he's supposed to be a sword master, he has no idea how to fight anybody and has no interest in fighting anybody. The ending is wonderful. I won't give it away. I really encourage you to watch it because it's wonderfully well done. But it's also set against the background of the 47 Ronin, the famous Chushingura incident. It turns out that several of the warriors, the Ronin, are hiding out in the same slum that he's in, and, throughout this. And there's also a very good one called Twilight Samurai in English. Tasugare Seibe is his original title. It came out just about the same time as the Tom Cruise movie, which we were talking about before the webinar here. But it's a fun movie, but it's a terrible movie in terms of historical accuracy. Coincidentally, it stars Sanada Hiroyuki, who was also in the Tom Cruise movie. He played the sword teacher in the Cruise movie, but he plays the very end of the Tokugawa period, and as you the Bakumatsu period, and leading into the Meiji period. Warrior retainer. And again, it gives you a very, very different picture of what the reality of life for samurai was like versus the image you see in most movies. It has a wonderful, probably the most realistic sword duel ever filmed toward the end of the movie as well. So I like to use those, but yeah, I think there are probably others too.
Now that you mentioned seppuku, other question that came in, what impact did Minamoto Yoshitsune have on the samurai ethos, particularly seppuku?
Well, it kind of depends on whether you're talking about Yoshitsune, the real person, or Yoshitsune, the literary character, right? It's same thing. You can say the same thing about George Washington, for example. You know, I doubt that he actually threw a silver dollar across the Potomac. I doubt that he really chopped down a cherry tree. But you know, those sorts of things have a real effect on American popular culture and ideals and images of them and images on manhood and all the other things you want to read into it. And Yoshitsune certainly did that, right? He becomes an important literary hero. He's probably the best example, the most beloved and the most famous example of the trope of the failed hero that Ivan Morris wrote about years ago. The Japanese somehow tend to prefer their heroes to screw up. Successful people don't become heroes. They're not Minamoto Yoritomo, who founds the shogunate. It's his younger brother who dies miserably, but pure of heart and selfless. The reality for Yoshitsune is probably not so much. And so, you know, I think that the real Yoshitsune probably had very little effect on samurai behavior, but this literary image, of course, obviously did, at least for later generations once it was developed.
Other questions are, just let me see, how, if at all, does Bushido relate to shinobi, or I guess a ninja? Just use it.
I would say not at all. You know, I don't want to get too deep into the whole idea of ninja and such, because I'll have people climbing up onto my lanai here and trying to assassinate me again. But you know, 99% of what people think they know about ninja and ninjutsu comes from movies, and it's a total artificial creation. Certainly there were spies and assassins, and there were groups that more or less specialized in this. But I've said this before, and I'll repeat it, that being a ninja is really a function. What you see in the movies, this idea of a secret group of non-samurai warriors that were the hereditary enemies of the samurai, is nothing but movie manufacturing. Ninja, for the most part, was a function. You know, you could go off and ninja, basically. I mean, the word isn't actually a verb, but it's better to think of that. Just like in the modern military, you know, people are not born to be snipers or pilots or whatever. You know, it's an occupation, and even snipers or whatever, you know, might perform other functions on the battlefield under other circumstances. So certainly there are people that kind of specialize in it and do mostly that, or maybe exclusively that. So yeah, I don't think there's any real connection at all.
I have quite a few questions, but what are some of key events in international literature, philosophy, or domestic influence that caused the most major shifts in the concept of honor?
That's a tough question for me to feel very well. I mean, because it's really a 20th century subject, and you know, my work is earlier. But there is this big shift that happens in the beginning of the Meiji period. You start to see writers like Nitobe and others that are beginning to talk about samurai values and to try to universalize them. That's the big switch. It goes from being a code that was designed specifically to set samurai apart from everybody else to being one that's supposed to be inclusive of all Japanese, and I guess to set Japanese apart from the world. So you have Nitobei's book. You have there's off the top of my head, I can't give you any real specifics, but there are things like Chushingura, or not Chushingura, Hagakure. Is another very famous book. It's probably the second most famous book outside of Japan on warriorness or on Bushidō. This became very popular in the somewhere around, I think, beginning in the late Meiji period. Maybe it was a little bit later than that because the Imperial Army picked it up. But it was an incredibly obscure text before that, as just something written, and I think by somebody who was totally and utterly out of step with his time, a kind of weird anachronism, who wanted to commit suicide when his lord died and wasn't allowed to because it was now forbidden by both shogunal and daimyo law. So he did the next best thing. He retired and went off to but he has all these very, very weird ideas. And if you go through it blow by blow, you know, the famous opening line about I have found that the way of a warrior is to die. That's about as far from the sort of ethic that any commander wants his soldiers to be following as it's possible to get. And yet you pick that up. And of course, the Imperial Army picked up on that for World War II, especially as things started turning ugly. And you start to get emphasis on things like the kamikaze and the kaizu and those sorts of things, or kaiten, sorry, the suicide submarines and things, and the famous bonsai charges, sorry, of in the battle for Okinawa and things which starts to make sense under those contexts, because it's not because it ordinarily militarily makes any sense at all, but because of the very specific circumstances. If every warrior is going to, or every soldier is going to trade himself until and never surrender, then you can slow down the otherwise inevitable advance of a much superior force. But ordinarily, you don't want that. Right. I remember George C. Scott's wonderful portrayal of this. If you've seen the movie Patton, Patton's famous line about no poor dumb son of a bitch ever won a war by dying for his country. You win it by making a lot of other poor dumb sons of bitches die for their country. And that's normal military thought. So Hagakure very out of step for that. But there's a whole long series of things that are coming out, a lot of important Bushido writers, and I've rightly been accused of sort of oversimplifying that in my article on Bushido Revolt. I sort of jumped over the fact that this is a gradual development of this that kind of gets hidden, I think, in the way I presented it. But that really wasn't my point. The main point was that what comes out of this is very different from what went into it, both coming into the early modern period from the classical and medieval tradition, and coming from the early modern period into the modern interpretations of things.
I'm afraid we are out of time, but thank you again, Professor Friday, for a great presentation and discussion, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Please remember to visit our exhibition in Hoover Tower, and online, the website address as well as information should be shown on the screen now. And we hope you enjoyed today's presentation. We look forward to seeing you again at our next Fanning the Flames speaker series featuring Professor Xiaotan Tan. Her talk title is Harmony and Conflict, Propaganda Duel Between Japan and China During the Early 20th Century. Please join us at noon on May 19th. Thank you.